Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're looking at, well, this is interesting. It's Enbridge, a major pipeline company, and Indigenous communities in Canada.
Yeah.
So we found this article from the Financial Post. It's called Enbridge to meet with Indigenous groups amid flurry of pipeline stake sales. And basically, what it's talking about is these Indigenous communities owning parts of these massive pipelines. Pretty fascinating, right?
It really is. Yeah, it's a pretty unique concept. This represents kind of a shift in the way that the energy sector interacts with Indigenous communities in Canada.
Exactly. So let's unpack this a bit. If we were to try and explain this partnership to, say, a sixth grader, how would we break it down?
Well, we could say that Enbridge, the company that builds and operates these giant pipes that carry oil across the country, wants to work with First Nations and Métis communities, the Indigenous people of Canada, and they're getting together to discuss letting these communities own a piece of some of these pipelines. It's kind of like sharing a really valuable toy where everyone gets to benefit.
I like that analogy. It really emphasizes that this isn't just Enbridge building a pipeline and then saying, thanks for letting us use your land.
Yeah.
There's a much deeper collaboration.
Absolutely. And this isn't entirely new territory for Enbridge either. Back in 2022, they completed a project called Project Rocket, where they actually sold a 12% stake in 7 Alberta pipelines to First Nations and Métis communities. That was a billion-dollar deal.
Wow. $1 billion. Okay, now we're talking serious business here. So it seems like Enbridge is really committed to this idea of partnership. What's the next step in this whole process?
Well, according to this article, Enbridge is inviting Indigenous communities to a meeting in Edmonton. It's happening on November 20th. And this meeting is going to be a chance to really dive deep and discuss a potential new financial partnership.
Okay, so what's on the agenda for this meeting? What are they going to be discussing specifically?
It's all about exploring the possibility of Indigenous communities owning a share of these pipelines. Enbridge will likely present their proposal, outlining how this partnership would work. I imagine there's going to be discussions about the financial structure, the specific pipelines that are involved, and what level of ownership is going to be offered to these communities.
That sounds like a really big decision for these communities.
Mm.
What are some of the ways that this agreement could actually benefit them?
Well, there's a range of potential benefits. First and foremost, these partnerships can provide significant financial gains. I mean, this income can then be used to invest in essential things like housing, education, healthcare, even infrastructure.
Right, and this empowers these communities
Yeah.
to directly benefit from projects taking place on or near their traditional lands.
Exactly. It's all about self-determination and economic independence. And beyond the financial aspect, these partnerships also give Indigenous communities a voice in projects that directly impact their lands and their lives.
So it's more than just money. It's about respect. It's about collaboration. It's about giving these communities a seat at the table.
Precisely. It really does recognize their inherent rights as stewards of their traditional lands and gives them a platform to voice their perspectives and concerns.
This all sounds incredibly positive. But are there any potential downsides for these Indigenous communities? I mean, what about the risks involved in owning part of a pipeline?
That's a critical question. It's definitely something these communities are going to need to carefully consider. Like any investment, there are inherent risks involved. The value of a pipeline stake can fluctuate, depending on things like global energy prices and demand. There's also always the possibility of unforeseen events like accidents or spills that could impact the profitability of a pipeline.
Right, so it's not a guaranteed win. These communities really need to weigh the potential rewards against the potential risks.
Absolutely. Due diligence is essential. They really need to understand the terms of the agreement, the long-term financial projections, and the potential environmental and social impacts of these pipeline projects. It's important for them to have access to independent legal and financial advice to ensure they're making informed decisions.
This raises an interesting question about Enbridge's previous partnership, Project Rocket. Did that project encounter any challenges or face any criticism?
That's a great question. Project Rocket actually seems to have been quite successful. It was widely viewed as a very positive example of energy companies and Indigenous communities working together. And, for mutual benefit, I'm sure there were negotiations and complexities involved. But the fact that it reached completion and serves as a model for these future partnerships, I think, speaks volumes.
Yeah, absolutely. So is this partnership model exclusive to Enbridge? Are other companies in the energy sector kind of following suit?
Not at all. It's becoming increasingly common in the industry. In fact, another major pipeline company, TC Energy, they're also looking into similar partnerships with Indigenous communities.
Interesting. You mentioned TC Energy's plan to sell a stake in their pipelines to a group of indigenous communities is currently on hold. What happened there?
It appears they encountered some financial roadblocks. A bond deal that was intended to fund this transaction fell through, so it's put the project on a temporary hold.
So even with the best intentions, these deals can be quite complex.
They certainly can. There are many moving parts, financial intricacies and regulatory hurdles to navigate.
This leads to a bigger question. Could this model be applied beyond the energy sector? Could we see similar partnerships in other industries operating on indigenous lands, like mining or forestry?
It's a fascinating thought. If this model proves successful in the long run, it could definitely inspire similar collaborations in other industries.
I'm really curious to hear your final thoughts on all of this, especially considering the potential long-term impact of these partnerships. What should our listener be considering as they process this information?
Well, it's important to look at these partnerships, within a broader context. For centuries, resource development projects on indigenous lands have often benefited corporations, while leaving communities behind, sometimes even causing harm. This model really has the potential to change that dynamic. It offers indigenous communities a genuine stake in the projects and gives them a voice in how they are developed.
So it's bigger than just pipelines and profits. It's about addressing historical injustices and creating a more equitable future.
Exactly. If this is successful, this model could be a step towards reconciliation and, a more just and balanced relationship between indigenous communities and the corporate world.
It's definitely a step in the right direction. You mentioned earlier that Enbridge is emphasizing a no upfront cash approach for the indigenous communities. Could you elaborate on how that would actually work?
Sure. Essentially, Enbridge is proposing that the communities wouldn't need to put any of their own money down to become owners in these pipeline projects. Instead, Enbridge plans to use debt financing, and they're going to leverage loan guarantee programs. These are specifically designed for Indigenous communities across Canada. They're essentially acting as a facilitator, helping these communities secure the funding they need to participate in the ownership structure.
That's really interesting. So Enbridge is essentially shouldering the initial financial burden.
Yeah.
What's their motivation for doing that?
Well, it removes a significant barrier to entry for these communities, many of which might not have the readily available capital to invest in these large-scale projects. It also demonstrates Enbridge's commitment to making this partnership work. They're going a step further. They're offering each community $15,000 to cover their participation costs for this upcoming meeting in Edmonton.
So they're putting their money where their mouth is. It seems like they're really invested in making this a truly collaborative effort.
It certainly appears that way. They seem to understand that building trust and strong relationships is essential, for the success of these ventures.
It's refreshing to see a company taking such a proactive approach to engaging with indigenous communities.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a second. You've highlighted the potential benefits, but what about the potential downsides? Are there any risks for the communities that we haven't really talked about yet?
There are always risks involved in any investment, and this is no exception. One potential concern is the fluctuating nature of the energy market. The value of the pipeline stake could go down as well as up, and that's something these communities need to be prepared for.
Right, it's not a guaranteed return on investment.
Right.
What other factors should the communities be thinking about?
Environmental concerns are another critical aspect. Pipelines, by their very nature, carry inherent environmental risks. Accidents or spills, while hopefully rare, can have devastating consequences for the surrounding ecosystems and communities.
That's a very valid point. The communities really need to weigh the potential economic benefits against those potential environmental risks.
Absolutely. They also need to consider the long-term implications of tying their economic well-being to the energy sector, an industry that's facing increasing pressure, to transition towards more sustainable practices.
So it's a complex decision with a lot of factors to consider. It sounds like Enbridge is trying to be really transparent about the details and provide the communities with the information they need to make an informed choice.
That's right. Transparency and open communication are absolutely crucial here. Enbridge has been encouraging communities to ask questions, seek independent advice, and thoroughly understand the terms of the agreement before making any decisions.
This approach seems much more respectful and equitable than how these types of projects might have been handled in the past.
It's definitely a departure from the traditional top-down approach. This model really recognizes those inherent rights of Indigenous communities and their role as stewards of their traditional lands.
We've talked a lot about Enbridge. Are there other companies taking a similar approach? You mentioned TC Energy a little bit earlier.
Yes, TC Energy is another example of a company exploring these kinds of partnerships with Indigenous communities. However, as we discussed, their current project is facing those financing challenges.
Right. It's a good reminder that these deals are very complex,
Right.
and they can encounter unexpected hurdles.
Exactly. There are many intricate details, a lot of financial considerations, and regulatory processes to navigate.
This brings us to kind of a fascinating question. Could this model, if successful, be a blueprint for other industries operating on Indigenous lands?
It's certainly a compelling thought. If this approach proves to be a viable and mutually beneficial model in the energy sector, it could potentially inspire similar collaborations in other industries, like mining, forestry, or even renewable energy development.
That would be an exciting development. It would be a significant step towards creating a more equitable and sustainable future.
Indeed, it's a concept worth watching closely.
But now let's go back to Enbridge and this upcoming meeting. What can we expect to unfold in the coming weeks and months?
Well, the meeting on November 20th is really going to kind of set the stage for future negotiations. It's a chance for Enbridge to really lay out their proposal and for the Indigenous communities kind of ask questions and voice their concerns.
So it's just the start of a conversation, not the final word.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. We're talking about potentially dozens of Indigenous communities
Hmm.
with very diverse needs and priorities. Reaching a consensus is going to take time and very careful consideration.
It sounds like Enbridge is trying to approach this with a real spirit of collaboration and respect. But what happens if some communities are in favor of the partnership and others are opposed? How do they navigate those differing viewpoints?
That's a really crucial question. It really highlights how important it is for Enbridge to make sure that every community has a voice and feels heard. It's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution. Each community needs to weigh those potential benefits and risks, within their own unique context.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act. On one hand, you have the potential for economic empowerment and self-determination for these communities. And on the other, you have those legitimate concerns about environmental risks and the long-term implications of being tied to the energy sector.
Exactly. And it's really important to remember that the energy landscape is constantly evolving. The global push for renewable energy sources could significantly impact the value and viability of these oil pipelines in the future.
So that adds another layer of complexity to these decisions.
Yeah.
It's not just about the immediate benefits, it's about the long-term sustainability of their investments.
Absolutely. And this is where the no upfront cash approach becomes even more significant. By leveraging debt financing and loan guarantee programs, Enbridge is mitigating some of that financial risk for the communities. It allows them to participate in the ownership structure without having to put their own capital at risk.
That's pretty fascinating, and it's an approach that could have implications far beyond just the energy sector. If this model proves successful, could we see similar partnerships emerging in other industries?
It's definitely a possibility. This model of shared ownership and decision-making could really be adapted to other sectors, where resource development intersects with Indigenous lands, like mining or forestry. It's about shifting those power dynamics and creating a more equitable playing field.
It's a powerful idea,
Yeah.
and one that could contribute to a more just and sustainable future for all Canadians. It's a good reminder that reconciliation isn't just this political concept. It's about concrete actions that empower Indigenous communities and recognize their inherent rights.
I couldn't agree more. And while there are many challenges and uncertainties ahead, this growing trend of partnerships between corporations and Indigenous communities, it is a sign of progress. It's a conversation worth having and a model worth watching closely.
Lots to ponder as we move forward, and to our listeners out there, we encourage you to stay informed about these developments. This is an evolving story with the potential to really reshape the relationship between industry and Indigenous communities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.